welcome to the next in our series of Forgotten Masters. And if you've noticed, we've changed the title a little bit to Forgotten Masters and Monuments. This is an ongoing series. We've been doing this for, I don't know, Joseph Bricky's here. We've been doing this for what, 4 years? The first year, I don't even think we recorded. And then years 2 and 3, we recorded and started putting online. Last year, the focus was on a very specific set of themes. We did 10 lectures about the technology in art, themes in art, and we called it Artistic Arsenals. But we found that the thing that was most popular about our lectures was focusing on one artist or one specific place and going throughout that artist's career. So I've got a list, I'm sure that many of you do who are here in person or who are hearing this online, of artists that you've seen in a museum that maybe it was a provincial museum, maybe it was a big museum, and you thought, that painting or sculpture is amazing. Why had I never heard of her? I've got a list so far of about 800 of those artists. My background is in how artists were trained from the Renaissance to the beginning of the 20th century. I have a master's from Sotheby's in London and a PhD from the University of London, and I lecture here and all over the world on how artists did their work, the practice of being an artist. And I am very grateful for this somewhat selfish opportunity to go through my favorites list of artists who I know were once famous, but who I think we can reach back in the past, kind of bring them back to a little bit more knowledge. So just so you know, being a part of this lecture, you are now given the responsibility, the onerous task of being part of this reappreciation team. And I expect you all to have Jean-Paul Laurent backgrounds on your phone, on your computer, to have Tupperware parties where you talk about them. No, you don't have to do it. This is a new venue for us. We're here at BYU Museum of Art. The first lecture we're holding, they don't have any work by Jean-Paul Laurent, and I'll get into why we're focusing on it for the first lecture. But this is the first of, well, I hope will be a continuing relationship with BYU. BYU has a world-class collection, and it's the most visited museum in the state of Utah and one of the most visited and prominent in the Western United States. And they have a large collection of European to contemporary artists, and we're going to be focusing on some of the forgotten masters in their collection. So we're pleased to be here. We get to use their beautiful space. And in the future, we hope to be hearing from some of their experts in addition to me. Today and ongoing, we're going to be hosting these lectures in the same space where they've got a film series. So if you want to hang out after, they've got an incredible film by the artist Ai Weiwei called Human Flow, where he documents refugees throughout the world today. It's a 50-minute film. It starts at 6:30. So if you want to take a break after this lecture, which ends at 5:30, and then come back and hear that, please do. The series is sponsored by 3 groups. The Institute of Classical Art and Architecture, Utah chapter, the Anthony's Fine Art, which I'm a partner of, and the Beaux-Arts Academy, which is here in Provo. And I just want to say a little bit about this coalition of people that we've got. The Institute of Classical Arts and Architecture started in New York. When was it? About the year 2000? It was a little before that. We've got a few people who were there, about 20 years ago. And it's a coalition of people who are dedicated to bringing back not only a high appreciation philosophically for the traditional marriage of the fine arts, architecture, and art being the visual of sculpture and painting, drawing, but also artisans and people who are involved at all levels of these crafts. And they've got, I think, is it 15 chapters? Is that where we're at, 15 chapters? And not all chapters are created equal. Utah's chapter has got one of the most exciting groups of people who are building monuments all over the world and doing major projects. And I know people are busy. We're all busy. We've got kids, we've got families, we've got school. There are very few groups that don't just suck your energy but give you energy. The ICAA is one of those. If you can, go to classesutah.org, sign up. A lot of their events are free. There's a minimal membership if you want to be a part of it. I highly recommend it. Anthony's Fine Art is a family firm that started 30 years ago, and my father started it, and it has been a business that buys and sells art and furniture, museum quality furniture and art all over the world. And I won't be too self-promotional with that, but check us out. The Beaux-Arts Academy is based here in Provo, and we've got students here from it. I'm expecting you get extra points on your grade. Isn't that right, Joseph?
Absolutely.
Joseph Rickey, Nikki Covington, two of the instructors who are doing world-class work in teaching drawing, painting, and sculpture here in Utah and competing internationally, both the professors and the students themselves. I don't know if I'm leaving anything out, Paul, that I need to say about that. Because the next slide is about Michael Georgievich. And this is the last in kind of our preamble before we dive into Jean-Paul Laurent. But it's a critical part. We are so honored to have Michael Georgievich come to Utah. We had him for a season. He teased us with a visit during a year, a couple of years ago, where he was a professor at the Beaux-Arts Academy, where we drink deeply from his well of wisdom that he gained from teaching in Toronto, at Princeton, at the American University in Athens. And we were able to seduce him back to Utah, where he is going to be a part of this. So we went from Forgotten Masters to Forgotten Masters and Monuments, and he and I will be team teaching these. I'll be doing a lecture every other week here at BYU, and he will be doing every other week on the off weeks at UVU. And you know the Fulton Library where they have the enormous, beautiful Roots of Knowledge stained glass? The lectures that Micah will be giving will be held in that space. And we have a representative from UVU who, I don't know if you're going to be coming to all of these here, but if you can, we'd love to have you. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. But they're going to be starting an architecture program at UVU. And we're pleased with the ICAA, the Beaux-Arts Academy, Michael, and to a lesser extent me. I'm like the minor character in all of that, who are going to be helping with that architecture program as it gets started up. Okay, with that, let's talk about Jean-Paul Laurent. Who here has ever heard of Jean-Paul Laurent? Okay, we got a few here. You're going to be the teacher's pets today. A little bit. Tell me where you've heard about him.
I went with you to France.
You went with me to France?
Yeah.
Okay, is that the first time you'd heard about him?
That was, yes.
Okay, anybody who heard about him before that? You'd known about him. Joseph, how did you know about him?
My first trip to Paris back in, I think, 96, just so happened that the Musée d'Orsay was having an exhibition on this forgotten history painter named Jean-Paul Laurent. And it was, I think, the first time that he had ever been really shown or exhibited.
That's right.
He was so big.
Jean-Paul Laurent was one of the most famous painters in the 19th century, and he took over a lot of the official positions and commissions for the French government during the last quarter of the 19th century. I mean, we're talking about a time when modernism is ascendant, and he is basically the de facto head of a style that we have been taught in art history as having been, and I'm from an art historical background, the last 100 years, the position is the modernists came in, the impressionists, the divisionists, who are and the post-impressionists, and you know those old academics and figurative artists just kind of like we don't know what happened to them. They just fell off the beaten track. But in reality, it was a much more diverse world. It's like saying that today, because Kanye West is an artist, there really isn't such a thing as country music anymore. It's just not true, right? There can be vibrant multiverses that are going on at the same time. And Jean-Paul Laurent was maybe one of the most colorful and powerful of these figures. And I think as we talk about his work, you'll find out that his work in the Pantheon in Paris, his work that he did privately and in other buildings, has a lot of resonance today, but one of the reasons why he is forgotten is because his work was so contemporary in its subject matter. It had a lot to say with what was going on. So we're going to talk about what deep things he had to say and where his art was useful in its time. Just a note on the format for these lectures if you've never been to them before. We're going to go from his childhood up until his major works. So we're going to start close to the beginning, but before I do, who does he look like to anybody? Anybody got a because he was compared to an artist all of his life, and he embraced it. Does he look like anyone to you?
Rubens.
What's that?
Rubens.
He looks like Rubens to you? I like that, Corbeil. I could see that. That's not who they compared him to, but I can see it. Anyone else?
Michelangelo.
Michelangelo. He embraced it. He loved it. He loved it when people called him Michelangelo. Can you see it? There's Michelangelo on your right, and Jean-Paul Laurent when he was older. I mean, even look at that medieval velvet cap that he's wearing. He played it up. He didn't die in 1910, but there was an appreciation for him that took place in the New York Times. Think about this. New York is kind of the capital of the new, of what's going on. You've got people like Paul Manship who are working in New York. We're not really quite to Art Deco, but there's kind of this sense of the new that's happening in the new world. And the New York Times puts out this article of the greatest artists of the 19th century. It's like us doing an episode of who are the greatest filmmakers of the 20th century right now. We're in 2018. On our list would be Orwell and Kubrick and Spielberg, and we'd go to the very back. And they put in the top 5 greatest artists of the 19th century. Up along with David, with Ingres, they put Jean-Paul Laurent. And they said, his panel in the Pantheon depicting the death of Saint Genevieve was severely criticized, but when the storm which aroused passed, his fame was only more firmly established. And that's why all of us today in this room can, without a doubt, have that painting in our minds without being shown it, right? Just like the Mona Lisa? We'll talk about why that didn't happen, but first let's go into his childhood. He was born in Toulouse. Who's ever been to Toulouse? Tell us where it is if you remember.
South of France.
South of France. It's very different than the north of France. Toulouse, it's one of the major cities in France. It's in the top 7, but it's a different place. It's one of the largest centers for bullfighting in the world. We thought it was only Spain that did bullfighting. There's a part of France that's a little bit Spanish by comparison to the rest of France. They speak with a different accent. They have a different food culture. They have a very different culture than the rest of France. And not only that, but in the 19th century, there's this reassessment that they were more Roman than the rest of France because they were closer to Italy. And the people in Toulouse said, you know what? We're Roman. Those guys up north, they're Gauls. And we're a little bit more sophisticated. They're a little wilder up there. They're pretending to be Roman in a way. And that's something that was embraced by Laurent for almost his entire career. His first teacher that we know of was an artist who's mysteriously known as J.M.G. Pedoia. He was a Piedmontese painter, Italian, who did decorative work in churches. And really, if you had to look at this and say what era he came from, would you be able to definitively say that he was a 19th century artist? It's hard to know, right? If you had shown me this without dates, I would have said, could be 18th century. In other words, this is not an artist who's on the cutting edge. Is he competent? What do you think? He's a competent artist, right? But here's kind of more the point. The work that's going on in Toulouse, the kind of projects that are going on, are less about salon celebrity painting that's going on in Paris and other capitals than it is about more of a traditional relationship between artists and architects, of kind of an architectural relationship with artisans who are working within physical spaces and on building projects, and that's something that works very heavily. And I don't know how much to project his relationship with Corbeil, because I don't know how close they were, other than Laurent came from a fairly middle-class background, and the fact that he gets to work with an artist was interesting. We don't know how closely they work, but this is the first quote we have of him as a teenager. It is said that Monsieur Laurent traveled in his earlier years with a band of young painters who went in a cart from village to village of the Alpine provinces, painting rude pictures and little churches. Sounds like he's part of this like artistic gang life, right? Like, when I read this, I laughed out loud because I thought, okay, so they've got what, a mule on a cart, and they're going around getting out in their clothes saying, okay guys, let's draw a bunch of really ugly pictures in the interior of this Swiss church and then move on before they catch us. There's no other description. But I think what's really going on here in this description is this is what it means to be a bohemian, right? It's this idea that emerging in the 1850s and 1860s is the idea of an artist as a creative, independent, who's living a poetic and unshackled from institutions kind of life. But quickly he gets shackled because he starts working within the local Toulouse Academy of Fine Arts. And this is his first teacher. And I'm going to totally massacre because it's one of these kind of Alsace-Lorraine French names that's Germanic or Swiss, maybe more influence. Villamenses. He was an artist who had studied in Paris. And inherent is this is kind of an understanding of the architecture of education in the 19th century. And that is, you have a central education authority, which is the superior Beaux-Arts authority that's in Paris. And they have an École des Beaux-Arts, which is supposed to be just for the municipality of Paris. But in all reality, it is the Mecca where everybody wants to go study no matter where they live. And if you can't get into the school in Paris, then you do your best to get into the school in Bordeaux, or Marseille, or Bayonne, or Toulouse. And if you're a teacher in one of those schools, you're hired almost automatically if you've gone to the central school in Paris. But if you really want to have a career the rest of your life that's guaranteed, you go to Paris to study. If you're from Toulouse, you have to start in Toulouse. You have to start at the bottom of the ladder. And that's what he did. He goes to the school, he studies with Villamenses, I'm totally massacring that, I'm sorry. And he graduates after 3 years in Toulouse, sends his portfolio to Paris, and has to matriculate all over again at the school in Paris. Not really starting at the bottom because they kind of had a separate track for artists who knew basic drawing and so forth. But he's definitely not treated like a Parisian, if you know what I mean. So let's just stop for a moment on this artist. This is his first teacher. He's learning in his class basically 5 subjects. They are geography, history, studying from the model, which was kind of a classical Greco-Roman model, and which turned into life classes during the last year, where the models were posed in Greco-Roman poses, drapery classes, and then he's learning composition and geometry. Those are the subjects he's learning in Toulouse. How good is this as he as a teacher, this Villamenses? What do you think about him? What arsenal does he have? Maybe that's a better way of asking. What arsenal of skills do we see in his work?
Clearly anatomy is...
Speak up.
Anatomy is not... It's a weak point in his work.
Okay, so you're feeling good about his anatomy. What is he good at?
Overall, I feel like that hand might be just a touch small.
Okay, so you can quibble a little bit with some parts of it, but okay with anatomy. I can quibble a lot with the anatomy in some ways, right? He's got some really good elements. I mean, the back of that principal figure is beautiful, especially the transition from the highlight on one side to the light and values that go across the back. But he's deliberately cheating by showing us the back of that figure and hiding the other figure behind him. right? So he's getting away with having two figures in there, but only really showing one figure, right? I mean, and you see this a lot with artists who aren't super confident. But then there's also like the drapery's doing nothing on the on that figure, and it doesn't really look like they're the same figure in a way, and the weight doesn't. I mean, am I being super critical? How patronizing do I sound, right? But I mean, am I wrong? What do you think?
Well, I think some of those weaknesses are fairly typical of where he's coming from in that period, and so I think he's quite impressive amongst his peers. You know, for early 1800s, he's got really surprisingly good sense of color on the flesh and the luminosity.
The flesh is fantastic,
the
isn't
light
it?
hitting the figures. So I think he has great sensibilities, and he obviously has a serious training background in terms of figure and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me show you another image by him. I'll show you just one more. This is one of my favorite images. It's the kind of thing that we don't really produce anymore as artists. It's a really high-end comic strip in a newspaper almost. It's called The Antiquary and the Artist, and this artist is bringing a work to this art dealer, which is a situation I understand. And the artist is giving this offering, like his talents, right? And there are the women behind him who maybe he's trying to impress on some level. And this dealer, what's his reaction? He's not really that impressed. I collect these kinds of images where two of my favorite images, I've got just hundreds of them, are images of artists with other artworks inside their works. So I love that he's got this. What is that? A Madonna? No, that's not. That's a John the Baptist, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you've seen it a lot bigger than I am on my screen. And also artist palettes. Anytime you get an artist that's got a palette in his own painting, and you get to see what colors he's working with. But you know, we are seeing here a bigger arsenal of skills than the last image, right? Compositionally, how's he doing? What do you think?
There's a lot of storytelling. You know, he's staging the light in a way that's sort of the convention of sort of almost a theatrical approach to painting in terms of presenting your subject in a way that's quickly legible. He's giving us lots of little things. You know, you have the Belvedere torso back there.
Oh yeah, so he's showing off his classical education, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's still life elements which are great. That book is super distracting for me. It's like right in the dead center of the painting, and I kind of don't know whether to look at the faces or the book, or if the book is super important. Is it a ledger? I don't know. Maybe it is. Boy, I sound snotty, don't I? But I'm going to show you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm just.
Oh, you're covering your face. You're trying to. I'm going to show you what happens. Who he gets in league with when he goes to Paris and starts studying the École des Beaux-Arts. Another forgotten master, Alexandre Bida. Bida is the artist that everyone should know here if they're studying composition. And this is why. Because Bida almost never did anything in color. His main job was working for newspapers before the photogravure process was really invented. Meaning that whenever there was a Paris salon, Bida was the #1 artist on the beat who would go to the salon and create steel engravings of the works that were reproduced in papers. So there's a large correspondence between Bida and other artists of them saying, you know that work I did in the salon, Jerome would say, when you put it in the paper, could you fix this part that I didn't get a chance to fix in the painting? So in other words, Bida is kind of the man who knows everyone in the 19th century, has an encyclopedic knowledge of everybody's work, and has mastered all of their composition and techniques in black and white as a value range, right? So he's often taking their color images and turning them into these black and whites. This is a rare image that's in the Walters Art Museum that isn't on view, but you can go see it in their papers department. It is 24 3/4 inches by almost 19 inches, and it is crayon on paper. And it's one of the rare times that you get to see Bida just as Bida and not as doing somebody else's work. Yes?
One of the things I'd like to collect are old etchings of sculptures. So these sculptures in the Paris Salon, they were done as these etchings. And one reason I love them so much is because, and this speaks to the sense of composition, is that the angle is always just so perfect. That you get the sculpture at its perfect angle.
Yes.
And the light.
Which is hard to do because it's a three-dimensional work. Taking a sculpture and turning it into 2 dimensions. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that just speaks to a sense of composition.
When you see this as an original work, that's Beta's own composition and work, which this was a work that was created for a series of Bible illustrations that never came to pass. So you're seeing here him doing a particular moment in the life of Christ, and you get to see Beta's version of the Bible. What do we think of Beta here?
Lots of figures.
Yeah, and what does he do well with those figures? If he does it well. I'm going to zoom in if that's all right.
Well, his drawing is a lot further along than the other.
Than the other fellow.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is the difference between a provincial artist, which is a horrible thing to be labeled, right? And an artist who's working in the capital of the highest levels. Yes.
His drapery is really good. The characteristics on the faces are really well drawn, and the lighting is really beautiful.
Isn't the shock of that bright light in the center? And notice, Christ is not the brightest light in the room, right? It's that shock of the door opening, but all the lines converge in the center. Look at how much of the upper space is left empty. Brilliant compositional choice, in my opinion. He knows how to draw your eye around. There's a lot going on in this image, right? I mean, you've got an entire household. You've got still life elements. Notice the extreme angle at which he's put that lunette that's above the door. So you're looking straight on at the scene, but also it's an exaggerated angle, almost as if it's a camera lens, which is another discussion that we could have because the camera had been around at this point and they were aware of it. Here's another example of Beta, which is him breaking the rules of what most artists were told to not do a symmetrical scene. So here he's got this, and it's not perfectly symmetrical. When you look at it really closely, you realize that the doorway's not in the dead center. But he's working almost on what I would call this Poussin Bach level of counterpoint of the virgins going back and forth throughout the center, where he's telling the story of these 10 virgins who have different quantities of oil in their lamps getting to the bridegroom's house, right? And you start with one, then you go to the next, and you go to the next, all the way until the very end, which is in the center, and the light at the top of the composition. He is the teacher of composition at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he's somebody that Laurent credited with being a huge influence on his work, which is interesting because Laurent is almost always discussed in terms of color later in his career. But his compositions, I think, harken back to this very formative era. His teacher was one of the most, for his painting and during his last year, because you're sorted kind of into a studio during the last year at the École des Beaux-Arts at this point. And he was sorted into the studio of Léon Cogniet. And Cogniet started off his career as a neoclassical painter who was, look, this is 1817. He knew David. He knows De La Roche. He was a competitor of De La Roche. And whereas De La Roche takes on all of these monumental compositions, Cogniet plays in the salon, going to become, in this instance, more of a romantic painter, which is focused more on narrative and historical scenes and, just following the trends. And he's playing at a high level. But I want to read you something. This is just from Wikipedia, but it echoed everything else I'd said. From 1833 to 1835, he painted a scene from Napoleon's expedition to Egypt on the ceilings of the Louvre. Between 1840 and 1860, he operated a popular painting workshop for women, directed by his sister Marie Amélie, and one of his students, Caroline Théleven. If you've ever heard of her, we should talk about her at some point, maybe. And he later married her. He married well into his 50s. After 1843, he concentrated almost entirely on teaching with an occasional portrait. After 1855, he essentially gave up painting. 1855, he gives up painting. When did he die? 25 years after that. For 25 years, he almost never painted. He was a recluse. He went to the École des Beaux-Arts where he taught and he gave instruction. But he died in his apartment and was found several months later after he died. He's one of the greatest artists of the 19th century and died in almost complete anonymity. But he was the teacher of people like, who did the Decadence of Rome? It's in the Orsay. Couture. He was a teacher of Couture, who then wanted to teach Manet and Fontaine-Latour, and he taught a number of the great foreign artists who, he was a great teacher of, I can't be doing this this early in the lecture. I can't be doing name soup. Leighton was a huge admirer of Corneille. So, he graduates Laurent from, the mentorship of two of the greatest artists who are themselves forgotten masters of the era. And he competes, just like any artist you would expect would, in the Prix de Rome prize. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Prix de Rome is given every year to a sculptor, a painter, and a musician at this point, and an architect by the central government to go study at the Medici Palace in Rome for 2, sometimes 3 years. And once you did that, it basically guaranteed your career for the rest of your life, either as a teacher or an official artist of the government. And sometimes people would try for the Prix de Rome 4 or 5 times before they would get it. And if you didn't, you'd kind of retire to a life of being a teacher back in Toulouse if you were Laurent. He tried out for the Prix de Rome, failed, and said, I don't care, I'm going to keep competing here in Paris. And his first major work was this. Before I give you the narrative of the background of the death of Cato, which he did in 1863, I want your reaction to what you think about it as a painting.
It's gruesome.
Gruesome?
Wow.
Boy, you don't like horror movies, do you? It is gruesome.
It's shocking.
So it's shocking. It could be more shocking. Wait until I tell you the story. But it is shocking. What do you think about it? How's his control of the figure as a figure artist? What do you think? I'm giving you the permission to be super judgy here, people. He's not here and listening and saying and feeling bad about it. Okay.
There's a real solidity to it. There's a real structural quality.
Okay. What do you mean by structural quality? Do you mean like the architecture of the body? What do you mean?
Anatomy. Words.
Okay.
Like you look at structure drawings that are you go through anatomy art books, and there's those structure drawings where it's just talking about the forms of things, the shapes of things, the fact that there's a platform created by the bones on the top of the foot and things like that. The structure, the effect of the skull on the.
So you see that he sees under that. He's seeing the structure of the musculature, the bones. He gets it.
Yeah. There is potentially something a little weird about the head.
Okay.
I'll put that out there, but.
Okay. What do we think about the pose that he's chosen? Difficult on a scale of easy to hard. How hard is this pose of sword in hand, hunched in body, not at a profile, but at a slight angle where you have to foreshorten things?
It's a pose. It's surprising that he's using the angle he is for the foreshortening, because it's a pose, I think, that arises conceptually from your imagination more than you would pose a model from.
Interesting.
Like it captures the idea as much as it captures a moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's much more than a snapshot. It captures a story, and there's the way the legs are on the bed. He's sort of not really laying on the bed, but he's reclining, and there's sort of both two things happening just in terms of his position to the bed. But anyway, it's just very conceptual, I think.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I think you're right. My instinct tells me you're right. I'm going to tell you the story behind it. Brace yourselves. Kaito is the worst Facebook friend in these political times you've ever had. Kaito opposes the rise of the authoritarian Julius Caesar. He's supposed to participate in the Battle of Utica. He says, I would rather die than live in a time when Caesar/Trump is taking over the government. I mean, you can read a lot of this into it. There are a lot of times you could do this. You could say it with Napoleon. You could say it with a lot of people. And he decides, I'll read this. This is from Plutarch, who gives us the account of it, which everybody, you have to think about the salon where this is showing as being a pre-radio, pre-television time where people are going to see their favorite classics retold in cinematic quality. Cato did not immediately die of the wound, but struggling fell off the bed, and throwing down a little mathematical table that stood by, made such a noise that the servants hearing it cried out. Can you see all the parts of what's about to happen, right? Mathematical table. And immediately his son and all his friends came into the chamber, where, seeing him lie weltering in his own blood, great part of his bowels out of his body, but himself still alive and able to look at them, they all stood in horror. The physician went to him and would have put in his bowels, which were not pierced, and sewed up the wound. But Cato, recovering himself and understanding the intention, thrust away the physician and plucked out his own bowels, and tearing open the wound, immediately expired. Rough, right? Anybody hungry? Anybody want to go get something to eat now? Okay. Compared to the description of him pulling out his own bowels, I'm going to give you even more of a view. That's how casual it was. I failed in mime school, by the way. How gruesome is he compared to what he could have been, Paul, when you said it's a gruesome image?
I think just the way he catches the action,
Yeah.
he's both still and moving at the same time. The drama is so intense.
It's intense drama. Yes.
Yeah, and in his face too, there's just kind of a malevolence and a darkness that's different than the rest of his body, where it just gives you this ominous feeling, just
Yeah.
even in his face.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever made that face doing a Facebook post where you're like, I can't stand this moment. I'm going to stab myself to death. I don't care what happens. I'm kind of joking about it, but not in a way that it's this. If you're in France in the 1860s, you're living at the end of Napoleon III's reign. He's winding down. And you've got the growing threat of the Franco-Prussian Empire War that's about to happen. And there's this real debate about whose values and whose side you stand on. And he's not, this point, when you're looking at this is a very Platonic, more Aristotelian image that he would have been taught in the academy, which is you show the moment before the violence, because it gives a more awful imaginative power to what's about to happen. You see the blood being drawn at this moment, but you don't see the bowels plucked out. 1863 ring a bell to any of you art historians about what happened? You're going to kill yourselves if you don't know off the top of your head. What was a big deal in 1863?
Was that Corbeil's piece?
That was the Salon des Refusés, where 3/4 of all images were rejected from the Salon by the official judges that were all part of the old academic guard, and people like Manet, Corbeil, Whistler were all pushed out and not allowed to show their work. So here we have Manet with his Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe that is on view at the same time, and Bonnat's work gets all of the judges' accolades and is accepted into the official show, and Manet's is not.
You mean Laurent?
Laurent's. What did I say? Corbeil's. That's right. Thank you for getting it. So you have a contrast really in these two works between what seems to be the ascendant values on the Manet side of the equation and the Corbeil values. Now, I don't buy into the same idea that these are really as different as we think they are. Because Manet was looking at Venetian painting in the early 16th century when he did this. He was looking at Titian and, who was Titian's teacher? What's that?
Giorgione.
He was looking at Giorgione. This is almost directly a composition taken from Giorgione. Or we think, depending on who you talk to, Giorgione was a fiction and we don't actually have anything he created. But Manet is doing his own version of the past in an old master in a similar way. But there's a statement that I didn't include here. I couldn't find the actual quote. It's more hearsay from the expert on Gérôme. I may have shared this before, but Jerry Ackerman, who was a mentor of mine, who wrote about Gérôme, said that Manet got his first show at the École des Beaux-Arts at about this time. And it was there were about 36 works. And he got in there because he had a very good friend who was a teacher, whose name escapes me, but it'll come to me at the moment. It'll come to me in a moment. And Gérôme, who never said anything nice about other artists' works, even his own students. I think the best thing he ever said, he had over 500 students in his lifetime. He was one of the most prolific and dominant artists of his time. The best thing that an artist was said to have told him, was to have heard from Gérôme was, not bad. Can you imagine having a teacher? That's all he says. You're not like that, are you, Joseph? You're a little more positive. You're a nice dude. But maybe you need to be harder. You need to be a Gérôme. When he saw Manet's show, he left and he said, these are the sketches of a great master. About Manet's work. Which says something about how the old guard felt about what Manet was doing. And I also think, what do you do with that if you're Manet? Do you say, oh, I'm going to go in and finish it? Right? Of course not, right? There's just a very different approach that's going on here. And the reason I'm pointing out this difference is that Laurent is playing directly into the hands of the Academy. And I don't think that's as different as art historians would say it is from what Manet was doing on some level, because he's still playing the old masters in his own way. He's being sophisticated, but just in a way that's not as acceptable. We'll talk more about them because they start to converge later. This is the next work that he has in the Salon. Somewhat close, a classical scene, highly plays on drapery as an effect, very dramatic, figure almost in the first few feet of the image. There isn't a great deal of depth. Next work that he has in the Salon, very similar. This is Christ on the in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives. His next great work, which is his first history scene of Napoleon, is lost, but it's the one he first won an award for. We have no idea where it is. We don't even have a sketch of it that I could find. If you find it either online, those who are listening to it, or people here, please send it to me and I'll include it later in the work. But the one that maybe was his big breakthrough image was the death of the Duke and of Enghien. Does anybody know this story off the top of their heads? This is a very wonky topic. Do you want to say something about it?
He was the heir to the Bourbon throne, following at that point not having much of a future Louis the
16th
and Charles X. So he was their nephew, and he was the hope of the Bourbon dynasty.
So Napoleon is ascendant. And some people are looking for an alternative to Napoleon because they're worried about how he's going to be. And they find this reluctant relative, and he is not very sympathetic to the royalist cause. But the people who are pro-Napoleonic paint him as someone who is. And he is taken and has a straw trial in the middle of the night, is put up against a church with a lantern on him and shot summarily without a jury or trial of any kind. And Napoleon issues a statement afterwards saying, it should not have been done, this is not our values, he did not deserve to die in this way, and I'm going to have justice under my government. It's important because this was done in 1872, and this is after the death of Napoleon, it's after the death of Napoleon III, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, after the death of Napoleon III, and the Third Republic is still in its early days. And there's these real discussions about, do we want to go to a monarchy, or do we want to go deeper down this path of a government that is more parliamentary and less monarchical? And there are winners and losers on both sides, and there is this fear that the French are going to return to this Wild West justice days of the Napoleonic era in the early days. And this is a message painting by Jean-Paul Laurent of let's be careful. And it gets taken up by both sides. It becomes a real winner for the moderates. saying, let's remember this era. Having said that, yes, go ahead.
Can I ask, this is so dramatically different than, the 1863 or the 1867 piece, and we have that lost piece in between that maybe marries this extreme change.
Yeah, maybe it does. You wouldn't have thought this was the same artist.
Yeah.
Right?
He's going from a very conceptual, structural approach
Yeah.
to which is very Disegno approach, right? To the colore approach, perceptual. This is what the camera sees. This is unconventional lighting. These are plays of light.
Oh yeah, totally different artists, right?
Approach. Yeah.
And see, this is the danger of working on a forgotten master, right? Is that there aren't like 30 dissertations to break that down for us. But we do know that he has made this leap, and I think that painting in between could be a missing link because it's a Napoleonic era piece. But this is a German. You wouldn't have even guessed this is the same artist a few years later. I mean, this is 9-8 years from the other images. And let's talk about the choices he's making. I've got the study to it. So, who prefers the study's composition by a show of hands? Who prefers the final work? Overwhelmingly, we're voting for the final work. Why do we prefer it? Somebody.
It's the lighting quality.
It's more dramatic.
Why is it more dramatic?
The angles in it, and the figure at a different angle, and just all the figures in it, and the composition.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Composition is almost the perfect yin-yang composition. It's beautiful.
What do you mean by yin-yang composition?
You have the dark side up at the top that goes slimmer down to the right side, and then it's mirrored by the light at the bottom that's wider and goes slimmer up to the top. It's almost a perfect yin-yang.
And what he's doing here is he's making the painting narrower, right? He's cutting out the focus on some of the figures, too. Yes, you were going to say something, Joseph.
Yeah, just that same thing. The simplicity of it. He's reduced it and really extract the essence, where you just have this immediate reading of the scene. It's just very powerful and like Lance said, very dramatic because it's so immediate. And he's sort of whittled out these extraneous things.
I'm going to give you some beat poet wisdom. Allen Ginsberg, who wrote the Howl, is it the Howl? Howl, just Howl, thank you. He said, in order to achieve a great work of art, you have to massacre your darlings. He's massacred.
There's some
huge part.
There's some darlings there.
Look at how much effort he put into the figure holding it, having kind of a dark foreground and playing with the light versus the dark there. He massacred a huge part of his study. Yeah.
Also, it's more expressive in the sense, it's actually a remarkable representation of somebody who is surrendering to their fate.
Yes.
And with real grace and self-awareness.
And it has that kind of De La Roche, Lady Jane Grey element of the white pantaloons are symbolic of his innocence and purity, right? Her white silk dress. And then the red is symbolic of this kind of platonic blood that's about to be spilt in his jacket. Something that Howard Lyon, the artist, pointed out to me is that shadow is not accurate. Because if all you did was follow the line of the lantern to his head and where the shadow would be, he doesn't include it. He instead makes the darkness go all the way to the top for dramatic effect. Now I'm going to show you an artist who blatantly ripped off Laurent as a popular illustration that is still today in French books, basically using a scene, who added in everything and did the opposite of massacring the darlings. So, who prefers this new artist's work by a raise of hands? Look at how much harder he had to work. Right? I mean, maybe that's what he was thinking. I'm going to add in guns, I'm going to add in the hats, I'm going to add in this tree. By the way, brilliantly done tree. Right? I mean, a lot of this is very well done. But this isn't about the competence now of an anatomy, it's about compositional choice and emotional impact of editing the piece, right? And I think we would all say that this has a much deeper emotional impact. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he's working harder in other ways. It's an intellectual choice. I'm going to show you one more before we jump into the Pantheon. It's one of my favorite paintings of all time. Does anybody notice anything strange about the man in the chair? What's that? He's a corpse. This is famously called the Cadaver Synod of 1897. I'm going to read you the story. It's the posthumous trial of Pope Formosus, held in the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome during January 1897. The trial was conducted by Pope Stephen VI, the successor of Formosus's successor, Pope Benedict VI. Stephen had Formosus's corpse exhumed and brought to the papal court for judgment. He accused Formosus of perjury and having acceded to the papacy illegally. At the end of the trial, Formosus was pronounced guilty, his papacy retroactively declared null, and his clothes removed. Pretty gruesome. From this point on, Laurent was known as the Benedictine in the press, because he was doing these very kind of interesting paintings that were from medieval history. But you know what he looks like to me? He looks like an Orientalist. He looks like a Gérôme-esque artist who's using the colors but applying them to a different era. And let me ask you, how does this compare, just on a composition level space-wise, to where he was? This is 1870. 1863, he was doing this. How much has he changed? Go ahead.
He had done that 1863 one for the Prix de Rome, right?
He did that one for the Salon of 1863, which, it did, but it was contemporary to him doing the Prix de Rome.
So I don't know, I'm kind of going through this on my own, trying to figure out who I am as a painter outside of the academy.
Yeah.
I feel like that's exactly what he's doing. That first painting is very much student grade, good student grade, obviously.
Yeah.
But this is professional work.
Interesting. It's an interesting comparison. I like the description. And this is, we're not seeing the 7 years of him face the grindstone, killing himself every day, experimenting with how he's going to be different. And this is the piece that gets him the most acclaim very quickly. It gives him the commission to work on a piece that makes him that gives him the greatest acclaim, which arguably is still the piece we remember the most. But before I do that, I just want to say what could have been an alternative path for him. He could have been this painter. This is also Jean-Paul Laurent. This is Jean-Paul Laurent trying to become a portraitist. And who does he look most like? He looks the most like, to me, Carolus Duran, who in the 1870s was the most important portraitist. By the way, Carolus Duran was the teacher of John Singer Sargent, of Giovanni Boldini, Thomas Eakins. He was a huge influence on Sorolla, on Zorn. Duran is the portraitist who sets up all of the portraiture for the rest of the 19th century. He's basically the Van Dyck of the 19th century. But and everybody wants to be him. And the way that Duran, Sargent, Boldini, and Zorn make their careers in the beginning is being portraitists. You can tell that Laurent tries it and it doesn't take off. So what does he end up doing? He does the thing that works for him, and that's medieval images. There's a medievalist named Augustin Thierry, who he's joining these arguments in the 19th century of what we call the nationalisms of the 19th century. This is kind of the talk right now in academic theory of a lot of what happens in the 19th century is all about what national identity is and people trying to figure it out. And it all comes to a head with World War I and World War II, right? Of who's got the stronger roots, which race is the best, where they come from. And Augustin Thierry, who writes about the Merovingian kings and rulers of France and the Middle Ages, he basically says, these arguments we're having about the church and about rationalism about Enlightenment theory and about backwardness of tradition. They're not new to the Enlightenment in the 18th century. They started in the Middle Ages, and Robert Le Pew was one of the first ones who had this problem. And I'll just read you about who he was. He was Robert II, known as Robert the Pious. He was the son of Hugh Capet, who was a major figure in the history of France. And you talked a lot about his work. Do you want to say something about this, Michael?
He's the founder of the French royal line.
He's the founder of he is the root that France grows out of, essentially.
Well,
go ahead.
He stabilized France during the chaos of the disintegration of the heirs of Charles the Great, and is the beginning of France as the alternative to the rise of Germany.
Right. So he is, for theory and many French, the beginning of French identity, right? Capet is. This is the son, Robert Le Pew. Sounds like Pepe Le Pew, doesn't it? It's not. He's not, though. And he was excommunicated for incest by Pope Gregory V after refusing to repudiate his second wife, who was a distant cousin. Now, incest is not incest here. Incest is not marrying who the Pope wants you to marry. That's what it comes down to. It's that the Pope can arbitrarily say, the person who I want you to marry is who you better marry, or if you don't, I am going to say anyone who comes from, as an issue from your current marriage, is a result of incest and therefore has no claim on the throne of France. What's happening here is, in Laurent's opinion and in theory's opinion, it is the beginning of the fight between the French being able to control their own destiny or the Catholic Church in Rome controlling the destiny of France. And this painting is about Robert, who's in the center, choosing his pure wife to stay with him, and then reaping the consequences of his candle going out, his soul being extinguished in the view of the Pope, who is leaving at the same time. So this is, no question, this is a painting about politics. It's about who's going to control the government after Napoleon III and the Franco-Prussian War. And it puts in the mind of, even though he's called the Benedictine, Laurent gets considered and is called the anti-clerical painter of our time, over and over and over again. He is writing about the bad consequences of tradition. And so here's the is Manet the great anti-clerical painter? The modernist? No. It's the traditionalist painter. The one who's the figurative artist, who's the anti-traditionalist in the minds of those who are working. And I'll only show this for a moment, but I want to make a really stark point here that shows up again in paintings that we're going to see in a moment. And that's that Laurent, like many artists of his time, was living in the age of opera. This is when Gounod, Verdi, and Wagner are on the ascendant, and many of their part-time jobs is designing sets for operas. And it changes the way that the scene is set, because you get the two principal singers, you get the chorus in the background, you get a backdrop, you get a little bit of a stage that you're looking at in the scenes. And that's not just theory, that's really how they even talk about their works when they're talking about them and how they expect their audiences to see them. But I want to talk about, just briefly, the choices he makes here. What does he change from this watercolor study to the final work? Go ahead.
The angle obviously is different.
The angle. Look at how extreme the angle is. And I can see kind of why he's doing it, because he's trying to both get the action and consequence in the same piece, right? The action is Robert Le Pew, and they've just had a discussion, which again is Neoplatonism. It's this idea that we're looking either the moment before the consequence or the moment or the consequence, right? We're not looking at the actual conversation or argument. And he's changed it from a very extreme angle to one that is more flat. And in some cases, he's taken out detail. Notice how much detail he took out of the throne. but how much detail he added in the framing devices or in the architectural elements, the decorative tapestry, or wall hanging we should call it, that's behind him. This painting is in the Orsay. Has anybody seen it in person? Oh my gosh, the moment you see it, like, this is one of the most powerful paintings in the Orsay. And it was hugely influential. One of my favorite artists, who was Francisco Pradilla, was directly influenced by it. I mean, just look at the candles and the way they use the space and the angle that's taken into the painting. It becomes hugely influential. Laurent does several paintings about this theme. This is him and his wife that he's going to have to marry afterwards, because eventually he accedes to the Pope's demands that he get rid of his wife. And notice how he echoes his own painting by having the empty linen of where the woman was. And Robert is weeping, and his new wife, who wants to be the new wife in this situation, who's mourning outside the door. But also look at this dramatic, unbelievable, complicated composition of a dark foreground with a figure in it and a light interior, hugely breaking the rules of composition, right? You would have learned in the academy, brightest light in the center, darkest light at the edges, and not in the foreground, but it would have been in the background. I mean, it's just brilliant. He does another work that's also at this time, he's still playing around with Napoleonism. This is he wins the Grand Prix in 1877, but we don't know where the original work is. This is a study, which is also a peacemaking work, where he's got Austrian officials who are mourning the death of a French general who they just fought with. That's part of a poem with Lord Byron. And all of these images in the end give him the commission to work on the Pantheon. And this is what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about. Who here has been to the Pantheon by a show of hands? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, the reason why we chose for this lecture that we're having at BYU and why we picked it for the first lecture is because a group of us from the Beaux-Arts Academy and the ICAA went to Paris as a trip in the spring. And we're going again next spring, for those of you who want to join us. And we're going to make a tradition of this. And the Pantheon was a place that we all agreed was something we'd like to spend more time on. And I would say there is so much to see in the Pantheon. We could spend the rest of our lives just talking about painters and the choices that were made in there. So it's a little bit unfair to spend the last 30 minutes of this lecture on the Pantheon. But never fear, if you want to learn more about it, go to the UVU lecture. We're going to talk about the history of the Pantheon with Professor Georgievich. And so I encourage you all to go hear that. If you're hearing this online, we're going to have the lecture recorded and put up in concert with this. So let me just give you an idea of where it is. So if you notice, you can see where the Louvre is at the top of the screen. And then as you go down, you see the Luxembourg Gardens. And right next to the Luxembourg Gardens is the Pantheon. It's by no means out of the way of all the tourist sites that you normally see in Paris. And this is one of the things that surprises me, is that when I tell people to go see the Pantheon, they usually say, oh, I've been to France 30 times. Why have I never heard of the Pantheon? It must not be that big of a deal. But then when they go, mind's blown. The interior of this building is incredible, and I hope you all get a chance to go there. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the history of the Pantheon. It was built in its earliest times in, I think as early as the 700s, there was a building on this site. Even earlier than that, you could argue back to the time of Saint Genevieve, who was there in the 5th century. But we know that there was a building that was at least standing from 1177 that was in various states of repair and decay up until 1755, when Louis XV was dying of a disease, and he swore on Saint Genevieve, who was the patron saint of Paris, that if he were to survive this, he would rebuild her church. He survived. He started the process of rebuilding it, and it ended in 1790, which is a terrible time to end a church being built. Because in 1791, the French Revolutionary Assembly decommissions the church, because they're anti-clerical, and they dedicate the building to the grand men of the Patriate, of the government of France. And they take the next 3 years the remains of Voltaire, Rousseau, Mirabeau, and Marat. I mean, the most non-churchy people you could ever imagine. and they put them in the building, along with the remains of Saint Geneviève, who's the patron saint of France. It has a really spotty history. It's reconsecrated in 1822 under Louis Philippe. Napoleon III turns it not from a church, he decommissions it again and turns it into a monument. In 1853, during this process, Saint Genevieve's remains are taken to another church. And then in 1874, the Marquis Geneviève is the head of the National School of Fine Arts. And he takes up this idea of what we're going to do is we're going to recognize this mixed relationship that it has of being a church and a national monument. And he says, the Pantheon, this is him in 1874 in the press, saying, the Pantheon transformed from something like 23 years into a church and remains no less a Pantheon because of its pediment. He's talking about Foucault's pediment. That's this swinging scientific experiment which is still going there. It's a distraction. But he says, but it should be a church. It should be a church. And I think you found the best way to do that, which is to cover it with religious paintings from top to bottom until we can remove that damned pediment and relegate it to the bottom some court of the Louvre. In other words, he says, well, let's take this place and let's turn it into a church again. It ends up that where the altar is where they put a major monument to the National Convention. So even to this day, it's got this very mixed relationship. And if you look at the works that are in it, and I gotta apologize for these images. Anyone who's been to the Pantheon knows how hard it is to get images of the Pantheon. I've spent 40 hours trying to get these images and get good images. It's hard. But you see works by Puvis de Chavannes, by Léon Bonnat, by various artists who are doing works that are various versions of the life of a saint, and also works like this by Humbert, which are the four values of the nation, right? And this is a man leaving his family to go serve in the army. This is the life of Saint Louis that's done by Cabanal, who did the famous rebirth of Venus. You just get weird works. And in all of this, this is a map of all the works in it, where this red arrow is pointing, which is right by the altar in the nave. You have Laurent's death of Saint Geneviève. Anybody know what those 4 squared circles are? Those 5 that are right next to it? They're columns. Which, now I've got some architects here. So guys, I'm sorry, but the columns are the worst part of this. Right? Because you just can't see them. But it's the nature of the church. This is and here's what I do have to say, is that it makes it very hard to photograph. It makes it very hard to see the painting. Even in the 19th century, 1892, I cannot help regretting this magnificent composition of the death of Saint Geneviève was not in some public gallery rather than the Pantheon. For what are smoothly chiseled stones that are fluted column and pretty Corinthian capitals to the awful approach of death? What's funny about this comment is that now we almost all experience art in this sanitized, non-architectural setting. Everything's been taken from the churches where they were and put like on a wall, absent of its architectural context. And I think that that is the problem that you're seeing at the end of the 19th century and with Laurent in general. And one reason he's a forgotten master is because he's truly one of the last artists who is working in concert with architectural space and cannot divorce his works from it. So here is an architectural scene. The paintings are almost 25 feet high and 11 feet across, and you cannot find, I defy you to find a really great image of them. But we're going to take them piece by piece. So here's a color study that he did of it. Here's another color study that he did of it. And if you notice, there is, on the far right, you've got one continuous scene on the bottom in 3 panels, which is Saint Geneviève on her deathbed. And I won't go into a lot of detail of who she was, but I will say this much. That this is a person who secularists and who traditionalists could latch onto very well, because she was a saint who was dedicated to communal secular solutions to her problems. She was a saint who, during the 5th century, when Attila the Hun and his forces were coming, she organized a communal fast for praying that Attila the Hun and his forces would pass them by. It didn't quite happen like that, but she became this in-between figure who went out as a delegate to the forces of various marauding, not just Attila the Hun, but Vikings, who almost always organized a diplomatic solution rather than a military solution to the survival of France. And it's one reason why she was seen as being in this nascent, burgeoning community of France as its benefactor and as its organizer. Did you have something you wanted to add to that? Or are you going to talk about it during yours? You'll talk about it during yours. So when Laurent does Saint Geneviève, the actual title of the painting is this, which I'll translate into English. The last moments of Saint Geneviève, becoming old and venerated by the people, and Saint Clotilde, having deposited the remains of her friend in the tomb of King Clovis, in the unfinished church of the Holy Apostles, who will later become the Church of Saint Geneviève. That's the official title of this work. Mouthful. This is what the critics said, and it stuck with the work. Monsieur Jean-Paul Laurent a plutôt peint la mort de Voltaire que celle à Saint Geneviève. He has rather painted the death of Voltaire than of the saint. Why do you think he's saying that? Any guesses? Here is a... Go ahead.
Well, he's left out a lot of things that you often might see in a saint painting.
Yeah.
Like angels or heavenly light.
There's nothing supernatural about this moment. I mean, even look at the decorations of this room. I know it's not a great image. It's boring architecture. It's imagined 5th century architecture that he's put in. He doesn't have a host of angels like Tiepolo would, hanging out in the ceiling, or Luca Giordano would have. This is the most secular telling of the death of a saint that you could possibly imagine. But what he does do that's amazing is he takes this argument about her unifying various people and puts them all in one place. So here you have this very tribal figure on your left, along with the Romanized figures who are dressed in Romanized, sophisticated, aristocratic clothing. And here's the study for it, by the way. So this is the study. I'm going to show you more pieces side by side. But you get this real sense of him bringing together a community. She has brought together a community in the way that Laurent feels like the French state needs to be brought together, right? You've got a saint in a church that has now been turned into a secular monument, who in a secular image of that saint, celebrating the saint, is bringing together everything from holy people to wild barbarians, the Celts and the Gauls, and bringing in the Romanized aristocracy. How do we know that there are a mixed crowd here? Does anybody know who the nude people are in this scene? The nudes are the slaves. And that's an anthropological truth, actually, that if you see a lot of religious images, everything from somebody like Karl Bloch to Heinrich Hoffmann, who put nude figures in scenes of Christ doing miracles, you'll often see a figure that's nude from the waist up. And that's because in Jerusalem, and in even up until the 19th century, if you didn't have clothes from the waist up, it indicated that you were property. You were not allowed to have clothes to indicate your status of who you were. So here, what he's putting in this image is a mix of slave, of race, of aristocracy, of religious belief. And I just want to give some details here to show how good he was in this scene. Here's this figure in the foreground. Look at those feet. Oh my gosh, they're at the center bottom of the image. They're almost the first thing you see. And I want to thank Joseph Bricky here. I want to thank Howard Lyon, who were able to give me a lot of this imagery. I tried very hard to get good images of these things. Here's a study side by side. The study is on the right. Sorry, the left. And the final work is on the right. So this is about, how big would you say, Joseph, the study?
Only about 18 by 24.
Yeah. So 18 by 24 versus 25 by 20. Look at how he blew that up. And I want to give you an idea of how good of a drawer he was as a draftsman. This is a very bad reproduction. It's so hard to find his drawings for this. But here is him in another drawing. Here is him in another drawing that went for sale recently. Very broad range, a huge arsenal of skills. Here is an idea of what he looks like when he's doing oil sketches. What do we think about skill arsenal-wise? Here's another study side by side. Anybody want to tell us which one's the study and which one's the original? Which one's the study? Who says it's the one on the right?
The right.
Yeah, it is the one on the right. So you guys, enough of you guessed it. That wasn't, I guess, much of a guessing game. Terrible game. I got to play better games, I guess. What do we think about Laurent it takes him 11 years to do this commission, by the way, and he has 5 assistants, but he ends up doing the vast majority of it on his own, which is why it takes so long. What does he do well? Besides everything. But let's break it down. Let's break it down this. Let me just talk about one of them. Compositional intelligence when it comes to the placement of color. How does he do? And what does he do?
He really draws your eye through painting. Those areas of saturated red that kind of like move your eye.
If you just picked red and followed it through the painting, it would draw your eye around the entire composition. If you just picked yellow, if you just picked black, really high intelligence. This notion that we often say that all art is abstract on some level, that abstract artists weren't the first abstract artists. It's the idea of the values of light, of color. You have to think about how an eye just takes, for instance, the whole notion of color in a work. He has a very high color intelligence, right? What do you think about, it's very hard to group people in paintings. The rule in the academy is that you're supposed to do people in groups of 3s to 5s, and you're supposed to separate them with space. He's broken the rule, hasn't he? Does he accomplish it anyway? Does it work? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because of how he's using color and shape. And so you see these passages that just pull your eye around, even though the figures are all just crowded together in sort of a more uniform way.
How many times have we seen that military procession painting where they look like the same soldier painted over and over and over again, and you just think, oh man, he just should have just done the one soldier, right? This one, you can look at it forever and pick out a story with each one. Yes?
He kind of separates them by just the different angles that he paints them. So you have some that are more face on and some that are, facing more completely to the side or something. I don't know. It kind of, I think for me, it groups them a little bit, either by color or by positioning.
Yeah.
Even though they're not broken up at all.
Yeah. Thank you. Did I see a hand over here?
One of the problems you always have too with the big line of people is what do you do with the lower half? It's just a bunch of legs.
Oh, it's such a good point. And so he has these figures kneeling. And I mean, I remember having a professor at the Warburg in London who said, if you want to know how good an artist is, look at their feet and hands. He has the best feet. Oh my gosh, these feet are amazing. Howard Lyon sent me 10 images of just feet. And let me see if I can just pull up a couple of them from this painting. I mean, it's just, his level of skill and detail is unbelievable. Yes?
I think that's consistent from the very beginning as well. From the very beginning, the first painting you've shown us, his feet were amazing in that.
Yeah.
And it's moved on and it's translated throughout.
And when you're an artist, especially in the classical tradition, one of the first things you're given is a foot from a classical sculpture that's isolated and told to draw it over and over and over again. And you can tell that he's really applied these lessons, but then he's also got this kind of emotional abandon that he mixes with classicism in his work. This is a study. This isn't in the final work. But, I mean, not a super classical moment. And I'm just going to show you by comparison, he does around this time the Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, who sent by Napoleon III to take over Mexico, and he's executed, and he sends this to the Salon. And here you've got Maximilian, who's the bearded fellow, and you've got the cleric who's his personal confessor, who's saying you shouldn't do this, you should fight it. And he's saying, no, don't worry, old friend, it's all right if I die, it's nothing. And then you've got the Mexican authorities that are going to take him out and kill him. And who else did this theme? Was Manet. About the same time. And here you have the two works together. And they're not, remember how I talked about there was a kind of convergence? This painting by Laurent does not look like the Kaito Laurent, right? It actually looks like it's gotten closer to Manet's treatment of color and figures. There are significant differences in them, but there's also him being significantly moved by Manet's palette and treatment of figures. I mean, you could give an entire discourse on how Manet influenced the old guard just through this work. And once you see this work, and then go back and look at the darks that are in his painting of the Saint Geneviève, you can really see how he has embraced a little bit of Manet and modernism in his work. At least in my opinion. Am I crazy? I don't know if I'm crazy. You can tell me I'm crazy. It's okay if I'm crazy. I don't really know everything.
Well, one of the things that Manet was known for was using large shapes in terms of design devices rather than modeling the form within the shape. It's just a flat shape.
Interesting.
So you look at that crowd, there is full of flat shapes. They're not truly flat, but they read as a flat shape composition.
And that's such a great comment. And notice how he's got flat shaped moments. And that Kaito, when we first looked at it, he had the only figure that was in the first couple feet of the image, right? We tried to deepen by having this extreme angle. But here, he's almost got like a Disney cartoon cell. He's got a foreground, middle ground, background, all with figures that are all readable, that are on different planes, all in an architectural space. It's incredibly deep space that he's created, but flat figures in some cases. Like that woman who looks almost like a caryatid figure from the Acropolis porch, who's got that drapery that's just straight up and down. Boom. She doesn't look super three-dimensional. Doesn't need to. The eye creates the rest. He has one more image that I've left out of this. Notice how we've been looking at the three panels that are to your right. The one that I've left out is the actual death of the saint, which is supernatural. That even though they called him a secular anti-clerical painter, this is one of the greatest religious paintings of the 19th century, in my opinion. And I think it looks a great deal towards Tiepolo. And it's an angel who is unseen by the mourners at the moment of her death. You have the last rites being read, this candle, which is in the foreground, while the last rites are being read, and then you have the incense that's coming up that is symbolically bringing her soul into the same plane as where the angel is unseen, welcoming her into the spiritual realm. And in the foreground, you have the mourning of a slave and of a noblewoman at her feet. It is a 25 foot tall composition. And we have the study. I can't tell on which side the study is. I think the study's on your right, and the final work on the left. And to me, this is the most non-Laurent moment in the entire piece. It looks like a Baroque Tiepolo 18th century moment of this. He's using the drapery as a device in a way that he hasn't used it anywhere else. It does not look like naturalism to me, but it shows how dynamic he was as a figure. If I had shown to you Kaito and said it's the same artist, if I had shown to you the execution of the Bourbon Duke and said it's the same artist, I don't think any of us would have believed it by comparison. He's so different. I'm going to show you, does anybody want to say anything about that before I show you the last few images? We're out of time. Will you give me 5 minutes? Okay, go ahead.
Well, just that this is a wonderful marriage of those two sides he has.
Yeah.
That drapery, like you mentioned, the training and the conceptual construction of that is married so well with his sense of shape and color and so forth that is more towards the naturalism.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great observation. There's a reason why they called this work one of the top 5 paintings in the history of the 19th century in the New York Times. And as we know, the New York Times always tells the truth in this day and age, and we can all agree on that. Right? We have in the art world this kind of rule, this unspoken rule or unwritten rule that 80% of an artist's output resembles itself and 20% is experimental. When we're doing a forgotten master, I think we need to include some of the experimental because we don't want to define him by just the pieces I tell you, right? I'm going to show you a few works. He goes on to do a work for the municipality in France. He does another one in Toulouse. It's a very different style. This is it up close. This is him working on it. He does a series of tapestries about the life of Joan of Arc. He becomes very good friends with Rodin, who does a bust of him that wins an award in the Salon. Then he does a portrait of Rodin. This may be my favorite work he did, period. It's the only one I'd want to own. It's enormous and bizarre, but it is the ultimate painting about the hypocrisy of a bureaucracy. Please remember this anytime you go to the driver's license bureau. It's called Long Live the King, because it is a little girl who has to declare her loyalty to the new government to prove that she's not a threat to the new government. Look at how big it is. 54 by 72 inches. Holy cow, I want this painting. I want it so bad. Another Merovingian piece. Another Merovingian piece. Look at the micro mosaics that he's painted in the background. Could be a Swiss portrait, right? This could be by Sargent during his early years. He takes Meissonier's job in the Academy when Meissonier dies, and he does this piece as a dedication to Meissonier. And maybe the biggest shocker of all is this piece, which he does as a still life study, which sold at auction 2 years ago for $1,500. Makes you want to kill yourself for not being the one who bought it, right? Unbelievable. I'll read this final quote by Emile Gaucourt. No, not this one. I'll read this one. As a teacher and as a man, this is in his obituary, Laurent was well beloved. Many artists will remember the pleasure of the figure of the master as he welcomed them to his studio in the Rue Cassini, clothed in his long red overalls, high head covered with a black velvet bonnet. He seemed, as more than one artist remarked, like the real reincarnation of the Middle Ages, and it was his charming, disarming foible to show a naive delight when a visitor remarked on his physical likeness to Michelangelo. There was no trace of jealousy and intrigue in his simple, upright, and hard-working character. There he is. And that is Jean-Paul Laurent. Thank you for coming today.